So our shiur tonight is sponsored by Naomi and Herzl Lipner and David and Riva Green to commemorate the yahrzeit of Naomi and David's mother, Clara Green, Chaya Bas Meir. So we thank you for the sponsorship. Neshama should have an aliyah. It's also sponsored by Dr. Andrea Stern and Isaac Singer. And it is in honor of their children, Ben and Shaili's first wedding anniversary. So we thank you and Mazel Tov. And welcome to our discussion tonight. We're talking about Kiddush a little bit. We're going to talk about Kiddush. And before we get into our main discussion, I would like to share with you a brief story that relates to our congregation, to Bnei Torah. So it appears, and again, when it comes to history of shuls, you have to be careful how people view the past. People remember different details and perhaps different eras. But it appears, and this is from my understanding of the history here, that the general practice was that on Pesach, there was no hallway Kiddush. During Pesach, the foyer Kiddush, which we are accustomed to, did not exist. And the reason presented to me, from my understanding, is as follows, that when you make Kiddush on Shabbos, it is not a valid Kiddush unless it is linked to a meal. Meaning if Friday night I just make Kiddush, and then after making Kiddush I decide to go ahead and take a long stroll in the park, my Kiddush is not a valid Kiddush. Kiddush has to be linked to a meal. And the Talmud derives it from a verse in the book of Isaiah, Yeshayahu, V'karata Shabbat oneg. The rabbis tell us that when you make that declaration that it's Shabbos by holding that glass of wine or grape juice, which is also valid, of course, as I am holding that cup and I make a declaration that it is Shabbos, it should be bimkom oneg, where you are going to have a delight. Oneg Shabbos, the delight of Shabbos. That is the proper location to make your Kiddush. The karata la Shabbat should be b'makom oneg. This is what we are told. Now, the Halachot tells us that to have this meal for my Kiddush to be valid, ideally it should be bread. But if I have this meal from mizonot, from items like crackers and cookies and anything that you make a borei mina mizonos, that too is enough of a meal to have your Kiddush being considered valid. The Kiddush is linked to a meal. So if, let's say, Shabbos morning or even Friday night, I make Kiddush and then I sit down for a piece of cake or some kugel that's a mizonos, my Kiddush is valid. Mission accomplished. However, the Shulchan Aruch seems to indicate that if, on the other hand, I put out a spread of fruits and vegetables, so my Kiddush, I make Kiddush, and I want to eat after my Kiddush some grapes and some olives and dates and figs and apples and pomegranates and even some vegetables, my Kiddush is not valid. Why? It doesn't have a significance of a meal if you don't have at least a borei mina mizonos. That's what we are told in Shulchan Aruch. So it appears that based on that, since during Pesach, the shul did not want to bring in items for a Kiddush that are borei mina mizonos, because that means matzah meal. And for some, they don't eat the gebrocks. Then obviously the standards for an item with matzah meal has to be a little bit higher. So therefore, what you would put out on a spread for a Kiddush during Pesach, a daytime Kiddush, obviously you'll have the herring. And then you would have those potato starch tam-tams, and some other items that are basically shahako and perhaps some fruit. So the concern was that that is not enough of a meal to have a valid Kiddush. And if your Kiddush is not valid, you're basically eating before Kiddush because the Kiddush had nothing to take hold of. So therefore, it appears that the practice was that they would not have Kiddush here on Pesach. No hallway for your Kiddush. Now, 1 year, maybe perhaps more than 1 year, while in the past few years when I've been here, I've allowed it. And I said that as long as you have some fruit, that would be okay. Now, where did I get that exactly from? So there was a great posek in the city of Kovna by the name of Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan led Lithuanian Jewry in the second half of the 19th century. And as a great posek, he addressed many different types of issues. And the question he was asked had to do with a Yom Tov morning Kiddush, where they made Kiddush on beer and then they drank beer. Would that be considered a valid Kiddush? And in that discussion, he talks about making Kiddush Shabbos morning, and then not having borei mine mezonos, but just some fruit. And Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector says, you know what? That's fine. And let me tell you why. There is a halacha that if you live in the land of Israel, and you have a field, and there's some fruit on your tree, if you go ahead and pick the fruit and bring it into your home and want to make it part of a meal, you must tithe the fruit. You have to give the trumot, the ma'asrot. That's what we are told. If on the other hand, you are not bringing the fruit home, but under the tree, you eat an apple, you eat an orange, or you eat some grapes, you don't have to tithe because the eating is not considered a permanent eating. And in Talmudic literature, it's called achilat arai, meaning it's more of a snack. The rabbis did not require you to go ahead and tithe if all you are doing is snacking. So theoretically, I could put a little blanket, a little picnic make a little picnic under a grapevine, take some grapes, eat them, no need to tithe. That's the halacha. But the Talmud tells us that on Shabbos, you don't do it. In other words, even if the fruit was picked before Shabbos, Shabbos elevates achilat arai. Shabbos elevates a snack and makes it into a meal. This is what we are told. So when you eat fruit on Shabbat, even if you don't bring it home, even though during the week you would not have to tithe, for Shabbat it's different. Because Shabbat kova'at lema'aser, we are told. Shabbos elevates your meal. And the Talmud tells us, you want to know where we find the source for this idea that food on Shabbos is considered a different experience. And the Talmud tells us, Vekarata la Shabbat oneg, meaning anything you eat on Shabbos is oneg, is a delight. And it's more of a significant meal, and thus you have to tithe. So it says Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, since we are told that Shabbos can take fruit and make it significant, and it uses this verse, V'karat ala Shabbat oneg, and this is the exact same verse, which tells us that your Kiddush has to be where you're going to be having a meal. So that teaches you that even fruit is considered a meal regarding Shabbos. And therefore, he gives a green light for Shabbos day, which is only rabbinic for Shabbos day, to go ahead and make a Kiddush in the hallway, eat some fruit, eat some Pesach diktan-tams, God help us, right? Go ahead and eat some herring. That would be considered a valid Kiddush. That's what Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector tells us. Fine, so that's an interesting point, but I think what's relevant for us is to remember that after you make Kiddush, if you want it to be a valid Kiddush, be sure to eat. It's always good. And when one day, Be'ezrat Hashem, we merit again in this building to have a hallway Kiddush, and I hope it's a very good one, and we hear Kiddush inside, go out, eat something, and remember, while you are eating, number one, be appreciative of the good food that you're going to be enjoying, and number two, remember that validates and that solidifies the Kiddush, because just hearing Kiddush and not eating, you go home, you obviously have the obligation to make Kiddush again. Many people have the practice anyway to do it again at home, but it becomes a must if you don't eat. So the first lesson we learned tonight about Kiddush is remember to eat. It's a very, very important thing to do. Now, the main discussion I would like to have tonight will be studying with text. We're going to be studying here with text. And we'll start off with a question that was asked last time we learned. We had a discussion. And the question was, how much do I have to drink from my Kiddush cup? How much do I have to drink from my Kiddush cup? So I'm going to give you a long answer here. And the long answer will start off with another question. And the question is, what size does your Kiddush cup need to be? What size should your Kiddush cup be? And I remember going back like over 30 years ago, probably about 33, 34 years ago, it was a Pesach, and we were by the Taubes in Thornhill. Rabbi Taub, Zozan Gesund, and Judy Elashon, we were there. And Rabbi Taub showed us this glass that he got in some Jewish store. And it was a very fascinating glass. It was a glass that looked like a measuring cup, and it had lines. So usually on a measuring cup with lines, you have millimeters, ounces, perhaps cups. On this glass measuring cup, it had names of rabbis. Reb Chaim Noah, Reb Moshe Feinstein, Chazon Ish, maybe Stipler. Now, why do you have a measuring cup with names of rabbis? So you do know that we are supposed to drink for the Seder night or every single time we make Kiddush, a revi'it. It's a name of a measurement. It's called a revi'it, which means literally a quarter of something called a log. And there's a disagreement between rabbis. What exactly is the precise size of that revi'it? And different rabbis went through the discussion and came to different conclusions. So therefore, the measuring cup had lines with every rabbi's conclusion. Judaism is fascinating. So that's why they had this. It was, for Rabbi Taub, I think it was something cute to show, more than being used as a halachic guide. Now, why on earth is there a disagreement on the proper size of a Kiddush cup? It should be, on the surface, very, very simple. Because the Talmud tells us that a log, it was a measurement that was common in that era. The Talmud tells us that a log has the volume of 6 eggs. If for my Kiddush cup, I'm supposed to drink a quarter of a log, if that's what I'm supposed to drink, so 1.5 eggs should be enough. So David wonders, wait a second, size small, medium, large, extra large. So the average egg is what you go ahead, and if you want to be machmer, go with the large. So I, for example, if you ask me what's the size of my Kiddush cup, so I have my Kiddush cup right here. It's not exactly a Kiddush cup. It's not silver. I'm not so machmir in that area, but this is a Kiddush cup. And I measured the average egg. The average egg is less than 2 ounces in volume. You displace it. It's very easy to determine that the average volume of an egg. And since I know how to read a Gemara, and the Gemara tells us that the Kiddush cup is supposed to be the volume of an egg and a half, so since the egg is less than 2 ounces, I have here a cup. This is of 3 ounces. This is my Kiddush cup. Okay? But the question is, why did other rabbis come up with other measurements? We've discussed this, so we're not going to run through it in detail because I think many of us know why there's a discussion. And our goal is really to address the question, how much do I need to drink? But I want to start this discussion with why there's a discrepancy or why there's a disagreement regarding the proper size of a Kiddush cup. So look here what I have in front of you. So what we do see is that 1.5 log, a quarter of a log, which is a Kiddush cup, should be 1.5 eggs. Why is there a debate? Why is there a disagreement? So it works as follows. The Talmud wonders, what is shiur mei mikvah? In other words, we know a very important part of our tradition is the mikvah. So to purify a person or to dip a new utensil, it has to have a specific measurement. So the Talmud wonders, what's the measurement? And the Talmud provides 2 separate measurements, and that will create a problem. Measurement number 1, the Talmud tells us that the size of your mikvah and the amount of water in your mikvah should be ama al ama berum shalosh amot. What on earth does that mean? So it works as follows. There's a measurement called an ama. From my elbow to my middle finger, the top, that's the measurement of ama. So let's say it's about 21 inches, for example. So if you take 1 amma by 1 amma times 3 amot, that is the measurement. That's the measurement of the mikvah. So I produced here a picture for you. 1 amma, 3 square amma, that will be the measurement of a mikvah. Now, that sounds simple. However, the Talmud provides for us another measurement of a mikvah, that you should know. The mikvah needs to have 40 se'ah, 40 measurements of a se'ah. What's the measurement of a se'ah? So the Talmud tells us that you should know that in se'ah you have several cobs and there's several lugs and several eggs. It works out, by the way, that 40 se'ah is the volume of 5,760 eggs. This created a problem. Since the Talmud provides 2 measurements, one based on the amma, and that's a measurement of the human arm, and also a measurement that relates to eggs, comes the great Rav Yecheskel Landau of the 18th century, and he compared the 2 measurements. Now, he didn't take a body of water and throw in 5,760 eggs into it, but rather he calculated, which is very simple arithmetic, and he realized that with these 2 measurements, the eggs only filled half a mikvah. So this was a major problem. There's a discrepancy between the 2 measurements provided from the Talmud. And obviously, right, people didn't change in size drastically, that we know, he points out. So he comes to the following conclusion, which has had a major impact on halacha, that you should know, says Rabbi Yecheskel Landau, the eggs of today, our modern day eggs, are half the size of the historical eggs in the days of the Talmud. By claiming that eggs were larger, the discrepancy is gone, but the impact on halacha is suddenly that if Talmud tells us that your Kiddush cup should be the measurement of an egg and a half, if that's what the Talmud tells us, if the eggs today are smaller, so it needs to be today, your Kiddush cup needs to hold not an egg and a half, but rather 3 eggs, because you need to double the modern day eggs. Today's eggs are half the size of the eggs of the Talmud. That's what he claims. And therefore, a Kiddush cup needs to be perhaps 5.5 ounces. So, okay. You know, they assume, the Chazon Ish, for example, says that the average egg is 1.6 ounces in vom. So therefore, he says that 5 ounces would be enough for the Kiddush cup. But that is the reason why there is a debate. That's why there's a discussion, because of this discrepancy. And it's been a discussion for the past 200 years. While in some communities, they are convinced that all you need is 3 ounces. And there are others, like in Bnei Brak, don't you dare come there and give someone a Kiddush cup as a gift that's only 3 ounces. You're going to get into deep trouble, because the Chazon Ish says we must follow Rav Yecheskel Landau. We have to assume that our eggs are smaller, and therefore you have to have a large Kiddush cup, at least 5 ounces. And to such an extent that Rav Dessler, when he was in Bnei Brak in the late 1940s, early 1950s, even though he had a Kiddush cup that he inherited from Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, and it was a small one, of perhaps even less than 3 ounces, he felt that perhaps in Bnei Brak I should use a larger one. His wife didn't let him. But the point is that this is the source for this discussion. And many rabbis have attempted over the years to figure out a way if we could actually verify or perhaps prove this concept incorrect. In other words, the question basically is, were eggs really larger in the days of the Talmud? And the impact is significant because, for example, what Talmud tells us, according to Tosfot, that the volume of a kizait that you need to eat on Pesach is half an egg. If the eggs today are smaller, you have to double that as well. It's going to have a major influence on halacha. So there's one rabbi that decided that he is going to try to investigate this on his own. And he's going to try to figure out if it is indeed true. Are eggs today smaller or perhaps not? And to get into that discussion, we're going to enter into our main discussion tonight. And the question is, how much do you need to drink from the Kiddush cup? In other words, let's say you have a nice sized Kiddush cup. How much do I have to drink, right? Or even my 3-ounce Kiddush cup. How much do I have to drink? And this is very relevant for Shabbos morning. And let's say I try to do it the ideal way of not using a shot glass, which we discussed last week, with 3 ounces. And the only thing they have is some whiskey, 12-year-old, a good one. But nevertheless, if I drink 3 ounces, I'm not going to be in such good condition for the rest of the day. So how much do I have to drink? So there is a measurement that is stated in the Talmud, shared in halacha, and it's known as melo lugmav. Melo lugmav. That is the amount you need to drink. Melo lugmav. What does that mean, right? How much is it? So let's start off with reading the source. The Talmud tells us, Hamekadesh, if you make Kiddush, im ta'am malel lugmav, if you had a cheekful, yatsa, you have fulfilled your obligation. If I make Kiddush and the cup has the right amount, 3 ounces, but I don't drink malel lugmav, I don't drink a cheekful, vim lav, lo yatsa, you have not fulfilled your obligation. How much is a cheekful? How much is a cheekful? So to clarify that issue, we're going to move on to another area of halacha where this measurement of maleh lugmav is discussed. And this is extremely relevant because it has to do with Yom Kippur. And it works as follows. We know that on Yom Kippur, you don't eat, you don't drink. We know that if you eat a specific amount, it is not just the violation of the law, it's a severe one. It's labeled as a violation where a person gets karet. If you eat a small amount or drink a small amount, it is prohibited, but the violation is less. Now, if you ask what difference does it make if it's considered a major violation or a minor violation, we're trying to avoid both things on Yom Kippur. So the difference is a very significant one. Someone who is told by doctors, you must drink or you must eat. They obviously must do so, but they want to drink the smaller amount where they know the violation is less. What is the smaller amount? And this is the question that Talmud asks, and it's relevant for every single Yom Kippur. There are people that take medications, they can't skip them. They need a little bit of water, right? So they wonder, how much do I have to drink to enter into the more severe violation? So the Talmud asks the question, Kama yishteh v'yeheh chayav? What's the amount? So obviously you have to have a machloikis, right? You have to have a disagreement. So Bet Shammai Omrim Revi'it. Bet Shammai tell us that as long as you drink less than a Revi'it from this cup, not a violation of karet. Bet Hillel, on the other hand, and as you know, we usually follow Bet Hillel, Omrim Malelu Gmav, cheekful. Now, the Talmud, although the Talmud knows exactly what a revi'it is, the measurement of malelu gmav is unclear. The measurement of malelu gmav in the Talmud itself, the Talmud says there's two ways to understanding. There's two ways to understand it. So in the picture in front of you, you see a person, something close to it, with two cheeks, cheek A and cheek B. One way to understand the malelu gmav, is that according to Bet Hillel, the severe violation of karet is only if you drink the amount of water that fits into your two cheeks, A and B, together. So that's approach number one to malelu gmav. Okay, what's approach number one? A and B together. Another approach is perhaps malelu gmav is not two cheekfuls, but only one, only A or B. Okay? So which one is it? Is it both together? Which, by the way, if it would be both together, that's regarding Yom Kippur a leniency. Because a person who needs to take medicine would be able to drink the amount, well, Shammai would say, look at a Kiddush cup. Hillel would say, is that if you drink less than the amount that fills two cheekfuls, you're fine. If I take, on the other hand, the approach of only one of them, it's a chumrah, it's a stringency. So which approach do you take? Amar Rav Yudah Amar Shmuel, comes Rav Yudah on the name of Shmuel and says the following, and this is halacha, Lo malelu gmav mamash. Don't think it's both cheeks. I'm sorry. It's not, there's no leniency here. Don't think that the amount is the more significant, larger volume of two cheeks. Ela kol she'ilu yisalkenu letzad echad. It's the amount that fits into one side. V'yira'eh kimalelu gmav, and it will appear like filling cheeks. In other words, it's basically A or B. So it works as follows halachically. According to Bet Shammai, if you drink less than a revi'it, no karet. According to Bet Hillel, if you drink less than a cheekful, you're fine. More than a cheekful, there's a problem. Now, by the way, before, if a person wants the measurement, it's very simple to measure that amount. If I, before Yom Kippur any day, fill both my cheeks, spill it into a measuring cup, up to half of that, I'm fine. So if I could fill into both of my cheeks, let's say about 3 ounces, which I think is a good assessment, about 3 ounces. When I spit it out and I realize that half is 1.5, so theoretically on Yom Kippur, up until 1.5 is not the severe violation. Okay, that's what we have. Now, there's going to be a little bit of a problem in the Talmud, because by telling us now that according to Bet Hillel, it's only A or B, so Hillel is in essence more machmir than Bet Shammai. Because if, let's say, I drink an amount that's more than a cheekful, Bet Hillel says, unfortunately, there's a kares there. And Bet Shammai says, don't worry. And the rule is, you know what the general rule in Talmud is? That Bet Shammai is more machmir than Beis Hillel. So this doesn't work. This doesn't work. And this is an issue that the Talmud addresses. And it's asked by Rav Oshia in the Talmud. Im ken, in other words, if you tell me that according to Hillel, it's only one cheekful, I have a problem. Because the result is it's going to be mikulei bet Shammai umechumrei bet Hillel. You're going to find here a situation where you have a leniency of Shammai, a stringency of Hillel, and that doesn't work with the general rule. So the Talmud answers that, you know what, there could be a scenario that one cheekful is more than a revi'it if it's a very large person. When we talked about it in Shul there, they mentioned Louis Armstrong, or in the Talmud, Og Melech HaBashan. If he's a gigantic person, then not. Fine. Now, the point which you need to remember is the following. The Talmud asks the question, hey, we have a problem here. Shammai is more lenient. If you tell me that it's one cheekful, Shammai is more lenient. Now, what does that indicate? That if Maleh Lugmav is two cheekfuls, in such a case, Hillel would be more lenient, because clearly, from reading the Talmud, there's no question that the Talmud is telling us that it's only an issue if you think it's one cheekful, according to Hillel. But if, on the other hand, according to Hillel, it would be two cheekfuls, that clearly would be Hillel being more lenient. So as you see here, and this is important, that A plus B, which is two cheekfuls, is clearly more than a revi'it, is clearly more than a revi'it. On the other hand, a revi'it is more than just one cheekful. When we read the Talmud, this is a very clear conclusion. There's no question. Fine, we just learned the section of Talmud, which is nice. Comes the saintly Chafetz Chaim, and the Chafetz Chaim, as he looks at this section of Talmud, he says to himself, bingo, I could figure out if today's eggs are indeed smaller or perhaps not. In other words, if indeed eggs in the Talmud were much larger. So in other words, if indeed a revi'it in the Talmud is 3 eggs of today, so the Chafetz Chaim comes out that A plus B must be more than 3 modern day eggs. In other words, it must be that 2 cheekfuls could fit more than the volume of 3 eggs, if indeed. So the Chafetz Chaim said to us, you should know, you know what I did? He did an experiment. Bachanti venisiti bekama anashim beinonim. The Chafetz Chaim took a few average-sized people, and he asked them, can you please fill your 2 cheekfuls with water? He made them spill it out. And then he measured it and he compared it to the volume of modern day eggs. And he noted that the amount of water they could fit into 2 cheeks is less than 2 eggs. Lechola yoter max was 2 eggs. In other words, what the Chafetz Chaim is telling us is that it is impossible to claim that the eggs of today are half side of historical eggs, because the Talmud tells us that 2 cheekfuls is more than a revi'it, and according to the Noda B'Yehuda, a revi'it is 3 eggs, but 2 cheekfuls is much less than 2 eggs. So therefore, Harei, in the Chafetz Chaim's mind, Beitzim shelanu lo nitkatnu kol kach. They didn't become smaller. It's not so. We have a discrepancy, true, with the mikvah. Reality is an egg is an egg. And therefore the Kiddush cup, Chafetz Chaim believed, he said perhaps if you're dealing with a Torah law, you should be machmir out of respect for those great rabbis. Reality is a Kiddush cup is 3 ounces, says the Chafetz Chaim. He tried it. He did an experiment, right? We talk about the righteousness of the Chafetz Chaim and how he guided us in halacha with Mishnah Brura, and how everyone has an awareness that you're careful with what you say about others. Now you know that he also experimented to figure out halacha. And it's known that the Kiddush cup of the Chafetz Chaim is still intact, and it's a small one. That's what he tells us. You know, it's interesting. What you have in front of you are 2 halachic works, that over the past 115 years are in many ways the go-to text on halachic issues. In other words, there are many, many halachic poskim. The 2 books that I present in front of you are the ones that basically have guided us a little bit over a century. To the right is the Mishnah Brura of the Chafetz Chaim, which he himself sold. There's an interesting story, which is funny a little bit, that I remember reading as a child, that the Chafetz Chaim was very, very careful as he published the Mishnah Brura, that he not sell books that are in any way damaged. He was very careful. People are paying. You have to be sure that you're giving them a good product. And it appears that an issue that existed among printers was sometimes when they would bind, they would mix up pages. In other words, it was cut, folded, sewn together. And if the worker's a little bit exhausted, he might mix up some pages and things will be out of order. So the story I read was that one time the Chafetz Chaim was busy and he asked his son to take charge of being sure that all the books were checked over and that none of those mistakes occurred. Unfortunately, the son got a little bit busy, wasn't watching well, and a few of the Mishnah Buras were sold where pages were not in order, and it disturbed the Chafetz Chaim tremendously. Fine, this is what I read. And it's funny because I have upstairs a Chafetz Chaim that I inherited that goes back to my great-grandfather from the early editions, who bought it probably from the Chafetz Chaim itself. And that Mishnah Brura, the first section, has a few pages that are out of order. So I have upstairs a Mishnah Brura that got the Chafetz Chaim's son into trouble. Just an interesting fact. Now, the other authority that I have here is the Aruch HaShulchan, which we're going to discuss soon. And I feel it would be nice to share insight of these 2 great rabbinic authorities. But halachically speaking, number one, a Kiddush cup should be close to 3 ounces, even though most probably 2.7, 2.8 ounces would be fine as well. Number 2, you want to know how much to drink to fulfill your obligation? Maleh lugmav, a cheekful. And it is most probably about 1.5 ounces. So therefore, back to our crisis where I'm given in my shot glass here, my 3-ounce shot glass, 3 ounces of some good whiskey, but I can't drink all 3 ounces. I drink 1.5 ounces. That's good enough. Baruch Hashem, we don't drive on Shabbos. Now, I would like to share with you an insight from the Aruch HaShulchan. I think it's a nice one. There's a message there. So we shared something from the Mishnah Berurah, now from the Aruch HaShulchan. There is an early 14th century authority who tells us that you should know. Although we are always told, and the Talmud tells us, that to fulfill your obligation to drink from a Kiddush cup, you have to get maleh lugmav, a cheekful. The Ritvash tells us that you should know that there's a tradition in the Tosfot that you should know kulam mitztarfim lemaleh lugmav. In other words, this minority opinion, which ideally is not followed, but the concept is that if you make Kiddush and everyone drinks a small amount, right, 1/4 ounce, but among the 8 people there, you drink 2 ounces, malel ugmav, that's good enough because you can rely on siruf, combining the little bit of mashke that was consumed by all parties. Fine. Again, it shouldn't be relied on, but it's something that it's important to know. I can imagine, for example, in a senior home where people, for whatever reason, can drink a lot. If everyone drinks a little bit, it works. Now, what's the logic behind it? So this is a picture of Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, the author of Aruch HaShulchan. And it's for many rabbinic figures, his work is a go-to text. I have it right here on the shelf. I like sharing the story that a friend of mine, Rabbi Eliyahu Meir Keller, whose grandfather learned by the Chafetz Chaim. So one time my friend was visiting his grandfather, who was a rabbi in Detroit, and the grandfather had a halachic question. The grandson was sure that the grandfather is going to look at Mishnah Brura by the Chafetz Chaim, because after all, he learned by him. And he was quite surprised that his grandfather pulled off the shelf the Aruch HaShulchan of Rabbi Epstein. So it's a real significant text, and I think a beautiful insight that we'll be learning here tonight. And he says the following. You know, in the Bet HaMikdash, among the many good things that the Kohanim would enjoy and fulfill a mitzvah by eating was the bread of the showbread, the lechem hapanim. It was bread that was placed there on Shabbat, removed the following Shabbat, divided among the Kohanim who were present on that day. Now, think about it. At times, the Kohanim were divided into 24 families, and at times these families could have dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of members. And they're all standing there on Shabbat and they want to eat a little bit of the lechem hapanim. But if you have 500 family members wanting to eat from these 12 loaves, they were large loaves, no question. But how do you feed 500 people? So the Talmud notes that there were times that everyone would get the size of a pea, a very small amount, less than a kezait. Okay, so he notes that regarding the lechem hapanim, tells us the Aruch HaShulchan Rabbi Epstein, Ktiv, the Torah tells us that there is a mitzvah ve'achalu b'makom kadosh. There is a mitzvah to eat that bread in a holy location. Now, whenever the Torah uses the word achila, there's an understanding that there's a measurement you are required to eat. Achilahu bekezait. In other words, when the Torah says eat it, it means a kezait. But he wonders, but wait a second, if the Torah says eat it, and in general, eating means a kezait, so how does the Talmud tell us that every Kohen would get from the lechem hapanim, from the showbread, kepul, like the size of a pea, v'hu pachot mikezait. It's less than a kezait. So how do we understand it? Says the Aruch HaShulchan, you know what that indicates? That Ba'al Korcha, there's no question, and there's no other way to understanding, but by claiming the achilot kulam mitztarfim, the little bit that every party eats is combined together. And he applies this logic to the Kiddush cup. Yes, we are told, and ideally, a person should drink kimalel ugmav, a cheekful. But just as we find the idea that you could have different people's eating combined together and considered as if one person ate a kezait of the lechem hapanim, so too here we could use the same way of thinking. Achilat kulam mitztarfim. You have a tziruf. Okay. So that is basically a beautiful insight. We learned something from the Mishnah Berurah about Kiddush. We learned something from the Aruch HaShulchan about Kiddush. We talked a little bit about measurements. Many years ago, going back 30 years ago, I remember my late father being asked a very interesting question a very interesting question about Kiddush. And it works as follows. There was a person who was going to, I think, to nursing homes on late Friday afternoon, an hour before Shabbat, and would make Kiddush for the people who are there, a beautiful mitzvah. It's a chesed, it's a mitzvah. Now, when he would make Kiddush for them, he would not fulfill his obligation. He was planning to go home and make Kiddush. But, and there's no problem with it, he would make Kiddush and have them drink it. Now, even though when it comes to blessings, if I'm not planning to eat the banana, I shouldn't be making a blessing on a banana, even though someone else will be eating it. But since Kiddush is a mitzvah, so therefore, just as I can make a bracha on a mitzvah for someone else, I can make the bracha on Kiddush for someone else. No question. Now, the problem was that this individual was visiting these old age homes or nursing homes that were far from home. And what he wanted to do was to make Kiddush for them, not fulfill his obligation. But then, and again, this was late afternoon Friday, which, as you know, after Plag, an hour and 15 minutes before sunset, it's acceptable to make Kiddush already. But what he wanted to do was that afterwards, hop back into his own car and go home. So the question is, can he make Kiddush for someone else with no intention of fulfilling his obligation, when in essence, he's not entering into Shabbat? So maybe when do you say that I could do it for someone else? Only when I enter into Shabbat. But if I stay in Friday, and I plan to stay in Friday until I get home, perhaps not. And afterwards, the question was found. Rabbi Akiva Eger asked this question, and it's something that there's no clear answer to it. But interesting question indeed. So hopefully we gained. We'll stop this last part. Hopefully we gained a little bit from our discussion about Kiddush. And as mentioned last time, it's really a message about Judaism, that when we teach ourselves and teach others, and especially teach younger people, that it's a religion that values the world, that wants you to see good in the world. It's a religion that says that you take the pleasures of the world and recognize that it's a gift from the higher being, and then you go ahead and make a blessing over it, and that's really how you sanctify the world. It creates an environment where Judaism is not viewed as something that is here to fight life, but rather to enhance life, right? That's a feeling I always have. Now, we'll look at a few of our questions that were being asked here. If you have a Kiddush cup of, say, 6 ounces, wow. People still feel that they fill the cup even if they only intend to drink, say, 2 ounces. So the question is it necessary to fulfill the cup to the brim? And the answer is it's considered appropriate, because a kos shel bracha, we are told, looks more enhanced if you fill it to the top. And therefore, I myself recommend using a smaller cup. If, let's say, I would have only 3 ounces of wine or grape juice, I would not use a 5 ounce and fill it 3 ounces. It's much better to get a 3 ounce and fill it to the top. It's considered appropriate. It's more honorable. There's a list of 10 things in halacha that you want to have as you have a kos shel bracha. That's one of them. And that's what we are told. So that answers George's question. Now, someone just, a picture of Chafetz Chaim Muga. When the Chafetz Chaim, I mentioned the story about his books. So when the Chafetz Chaim would check the books to be sure that they were printed in order, he would write the word Mugaha. Mugha was checked. And I have here a few books of Muga, and I understand that David also has books. So it's considered a rare item that you have the handwriting of the Chafetz Chaim basically saying, I checked the book. Okay, so that's a very important and very interesting fact indeed. So you have, I think, a little bit of a history of why different communities have different practices. Obviously, it's more of a Seder night, but Kiddush is something that we make at all times. I think we also had a good review of Kiddush b'makom suda, which is actually important. The importance of having a meal after making Kiddush. And sometimes it could be a problem if, let's say, you hear Kiddush here in shul, and then you enter into a 15-minute discussion, argument, and then you go out. It's problematic. That gap is a problematic. Ideally, you hear Kiddush, no need to run. food will be there, hopefully, and you go ahead and eat. A gap or leaving the room has an impact on the Kiddush b'makom suda. And number two, I want to mention that even though we had this very interesting insight of Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan that gives a green light for fruit to be considered a meal, he only gave that green light for Shabbos day, where Kiddush is rabbinic. Friday night is different. And Friday night, you want to make Kiddush, and it should be a Kiddush, b'makom suda, be sure you have a real meal. So no Friday night fruit meals. You have to have a real meal, because it will have an impact. Number one, Shabbos should have a real meal. And number two, it will have an impact on your Kiddush as well.
If Fran is davening at home and she finishes davening but wants to have a coffee before I come home on Shabbos morning, can she have a coffee, or does she have to make Kiddush first?
Excellent question. Excellent question. So there's a Ramosha Feinstein that argues that theoretically it's not yet the time of Kiddush until the husband gets home. That's what he argues. It's an interesting Kiddush. It's an interesting Kiddush. It could be, and what I would suggest is, I hope it's a good coffee, number one. If it's a good coffee, why not just make that as a Kiddush? In other words, use the coffee as a Kiddush. It is a Chamar Medina, and especially if it's a good coffee, it is a.
Does instant count?
It's instant. It's not a good.
Okay, if it's a good instant, okay, not Folgers. Folgers is not good.
Taster's choice.
What's one? Which one?
Taster's choice.
Okay. Now we're talking a little bit. Not a Starbucks via, but it's a taster's choice. If it's with a little bit of milk and it's filled and you enjoy it,
Is that preferable, or can I just wait for David?
It depends how long he schmoozed. Depends how long the laning took. Some balei kara take long sometimes. You know how it works. So in reality is you can make Kiddush over that cup. Make a Kiddush over it. And again, Kiddush, by the way, are not those verses are nice things. But even without the verses, if you make a shahakol nia bidvaro with in mind that this is my Kiddush, and then you can hear again, that would work.
Does she have to say Al Kain Berach or not?
If she wants, it's not a ma'akev, meaning the main Kiddush is the bracha. Verses are tradition. There are those, by the way, that don't say the verses. But she could say Al Kain Berach as Yom HaShavai or the whole verse. But that's an option that works. You could wait, or you can make Kiddush, or you can even rely on drink. But that's I think the safest is just consider it Kiddush and enjoy your taster's choice if that's your choice. Very good, Rabosai.